Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay. Welcome, Austin and Jim. Last time we talked, we ended the discussion about COVID-19 with, I still had some questions in my mind that I wanted to explore. One of them, Jim, and Austin, was how the Belt and Road Initiative helped spread the virus.
The Belt and Road Initiative may have had some impact because there is some additional, traffic back and forth to China. The key question is how much of that traffic was coming out of Hubei province, because that's where it started. Even the Chinese scientists, the ones who haven't been arrested or disappeared or given a sound, talking to, have said. I mean, they've already published those studies, and they've gotten out in the wild. But the trouble is, Wuhan is a major, it's sort of the Atlanta of central China. Everything passes through Wuhan. So there was plenty of opportunity for anybody coming out of Wuhan to spread it. But in general, the Chinese have been, all over the world. Mainly the tourists. Now, the tourists stopped coming early on. Thailand was already early in the start of the year. They were complaining that there were fewer Chinese tourists. Now, why that was, I don't know if it wasn't really about health things. I think it was more political. But the Chinese tourism dropped off everywhere now, obviously, because of the travel bans. But yeah, Chinese commercial travelers, more than tourists, spread it all over the place. The tourists go to a few locations, Hawaii being one of them, for example. But the commercial travelers, of which there are many, because China goes to the Belt and Road, but actually the Belt and Road and Chinese overseas investments sort of go hand in hand. Somebody realized, literally, this is how it worked out. They realized, why don't we organize all this overseas activity? And that's how they got the One Belt, One Road. They said, all right, yeah. And by organized, they meant, they're all capitalists now. We'll simply make it easier to borrow money if you're investing in a project that it fits in with the Belt and Road Initiative. But in that, anyway, because the state allocated more credit at favorable terms to Belt and Road investments, there are more Chinese going out there. Not just workers, but also technical people, management. They would fly back and forth, although that may be changing. I think even the Chinese are they're probably using video conferencing a lot more now. And a lot of people, I've heard this already from some of the people I've been video conferencing. They said, this ain't too bad. Although in some operations have the huge, the multi-screen, the wall of monitors, and it's almost like you're sitting in the same room. I think, again, it's like anything else. Once you're forced to use it, like computers early on, a lot of people say, oh, I'll never touch a computer. Learn how to type, forget about it. That's women's work. I knew a lot of guys like that. And a lot of them never really picked up on it, but a lot of them did. And, of course, the next generation coming up, you were a real oddball if you wouldn't get online and at least answer your email or text and what have you. So I think this will give that a boost. The airliners don't want to hear about this, and a lot of people do not like business traveling. The Chinese do, at least most of them. I think some of them are getting tired of it now, but they still believe in sending people out to supervise and operate investments or learn from locals. And that's not going to change. So China is always going to be a very dangerous vector for these diseases. Now, this brings up another issue, China trying to deflect the blame. It's straight out of Wuhan, so to speak. They're speaking out of, two messages coming out of the same mouth, as it were. One in China, where they're basically clamping down on the wet markets. In other words, where they sell live wild animals. And they're basically enforcing the endangered animals restrictions, which in the past they say they would, but they didn't. But now they are. In fact, about a month after in the midst of the Wuhan, crisis, as it were, they finally enacted a law outlawing the wet markets, the wild game markets, now the thing is, will they enforce it? They'll enforce it now, but will they enforce it next year? Because these corona diseases, the corona meaning out of an animal, as we're from crossing the species barrier, has been going on for thousands of years. I mean, more and more of the worst human diseases they can trace back to wild animals. I even found I was trying to find out if the measles, which hit the Roman Empire twice in the 2nd century and the 6th century, with devastating results, especially in urban areas. That apparently was traced to Central Asia, some extinct species of wild buffalo. But in China, it was always a factory for corona diseases, because so much of the population, the farmers, they thought nothing, in the wintertime, they bring the animals inside where the people were, because they share all that body heat. It was just their custom. People were constantly sharing breath, as it were, with ducks, pigs, you name it, all sorts of birds. And of course, there were always the wet markets, which, even though they were mostly for the affluent, for Chinese New Year's and things like that, more people would go and buy these exotic delicacies for the holidays. So China is going to have to face it. They're apparently facing it internally. And this whole idea of blaming the virus on a bunch of American soldiers coming in to compete in a military competition is absurd on the face of it. I mean, some people will believe it. But, most of China's neighbors know very well where these diseases come from. And again, there are plenty of diseases coming from viruses that suddenly click with humans. But the worst ones are the coronaviruses, because there are billions of viruses out in the wild. Most of them have no impact on humans because they're not coming from animals. They're coming from all sorts of sources. But a lot of mystery diseases in history and in the future are going to come from some random, it's like a constant, a slot machine spinning all the time. And bing, 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 every once in a while, Homo sapiens is going to get the 3 skulls. And bingo, you've got yourself another pandemic. Now, we have the ability to have prophylactic, get medicines in place to mitigate the fatal effects and to vaccinate people. But that gives us basically a false sense of security, because as we're seeing now, I think the final word on the coronavirus virus was that it did more damage to the human population economically than physically with the disease itself. Because, poverty, a recession, or even a depression, that kills people. I mean, the epidemiologists have long known that. And I don't know if the media is going to go in there and calculate how many people died, from the next recession versus whatever. Because you can see now, as we've discovered early on, a lot of epidemiologists discovered early on, the impact of this is basically a super flu. It kills 4 or 5 times as many people as influenza does, and it only kills maybe twice as many as the worst influenza. I mean, influenza, constantly evolves, and some years are much worse than others. And there's been 2 or 3 years in the last 50 years since I've been alive. I mean, I for example, and my siblings and my mother, because of a family and inherited, resistance, we've never caught the flu. Never had it. In fact, I double checked. I said, geez, I don't remember anybody in the family being down with the flu. My father, too, I don't know what his story is, clean living, who the hell knows. But a large chunk of the population are immune to these diseases. And that's what happened when they had the first the Diamond Princess, and then there was just a recent study that was published. Iceland did the same thing, but even better. They basically randomly selected 10% of the population and called them in to be tested as part of this random thing. So everybody, they tromped in and got their boom, and they ran all those tests, and it came back basically the same results as the Diamond Princess. The Theodore Roosevelt, again, as we predicted earlier in some earlier strategy page piece, and I mentioned it again with more information in the one we ran today. You give me fever. They've tested 80% of the crew. Now, I estimated that they might have maybe 1,000 sailors sick, or basically on sick call, if this thing were ran wild, as it were, without any efforts to isolate and what have you, which is hard to do on a carrier. But apparently it would only be about 300 if it had basically run its course. So far, no sailors been hospitalized, and none have died. And of course, that's fairly expected with a crew of a naval ship, because you don't get sea duty if you get any physical profile whatsoever. So not only are they, as all military personnel, selected for pretty good health, but the people who get to go to sea, they go through another screening, and so it wouldn't be expected. In fact, the captain, who was well liked by his crew, the CNO is apparently appealing to the president to reinstate him because he made one mistake. And as Al Noffy has pointed out time and again in his work for the Navy, most of the principal commanders in World War II would have never made it in today's Navy. One mistake and you're out. But I think the Navy's coming back to realizing that nobody's perfect, and it's idiotic.
Didn't one of our famous I can't remember who it was, World War II admirals actually run a ship aground when he was...
That was Halsey,
right.
Yeah, when he was the destroyer commander. Yeah. And that was, I forget that Al wrote that up a couple of times in his various books. It was this, and I think you pointed out later on, maybe it's in CNC, that if Halsey had done it today, he'd be out. Now, who knows, maybe they would have called him back in if there was ever a major war. But that just goes to show you can be overcautious. And indeed, we're seeing that today with the American bureaucracy. The Food and Drug FDA and the CDC have been obstacles to dealing with the coronavirus. So that is apparently going to yield some positive reforms, because our current president, he's the sort of guy you screw up like that. I mean, he loves to cut out regulations, and now they're basically showing themselves up, as it were. Yeah, we're a regulation that should go out the door. So that's one of the positive effects. Because on the SARS, was it SARS? Whatever, the last major, super flu, as it were, corona-type virus, we had a large stockpile of ventilators and what have you, and we never restocked them. Which is one of the reasons we have all the problems now. Another thing that's going to come up in the histories of the COVID-19 epidemic, as it were, is people not paying attention to history, not paying attention to models, politicizing a lot of the reactions. I mean, you can see this in the different states. I mean, we have 50 different states, and they are all taking a slightly different approach. Most of the American states are not feeling much of this at all. I mean, the epicenter is in New York. And there are various reasons for that it'll take a while to come out. I think it has a lot to do with the immigrant population, not just the illegal migrants. Even the legal migrants in New York City are the highest in the country. and most of the coronavirus infected people are in those communities out in Brooklyn and Queens, disproportionately. Manhattan, very low, even with all of our world travelers and what have you. But again, these are people, who are probably in better health to begin with. But, a lot of the people who would be coming in from China or, East Asia, any place where the Wuhan virus would have reached first, they would have gone to the areas which are now the most infected because it has a head start. In the United States, we found out the hard way that there half the people who get infected, where the infection takes, they walk around for several weeks showing no symptoms, but breathing in on everybody they come across. But again, that's something nobody wants to talk about. I think for good, justifiable PR reasons, if you make a big thing about 80% of the population can't catch it, a lot of people say, well, obviously it's me, I'm in the 80%. I mean, that's human nature. So the certain amount of FUD, the fear, uncertainty, and doubt, is useful because it worked in New York. I mean, most people are, distancing themselves, and I used to think people were walking away from me, because of the cigar, but now I can blame it on the virus. So lessons will be learned. Some of them, unfortunately, will be learned too late.
Hey, Jim, there is something I read. I think it was 2 days ago, on why some of the communities you described in the greater New York area have a higher incidence of the virus, and that is that they're more likely to be riding subways into Manhattan or using subways than some of the Manhattanites. And that struck me as a former Manhattanite myself, as there might be some validity to that. And it wasn't one of these anecdotal type analysis. It was somebody that was looking at that kind of spread of communities that you just described. So
there was a few weeks when there were a lot of cases in the country that out in those communities, mainly because that's where the travelers were. Yes, they had several weeks where the subways were wide open. Nobody was wearing masks or anything like that. And that was the perfect way to spread it to a certain population. And that happened to be, unfortunately, the population that lives in those areas. Again, that's something that people are sort of saying, you can look at the pattern. They have the maps of, where the concentration of people and blah, blah, blah. Of course, the politicians are spinning, it's racial, it's Puerto Ricans, blah, 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 blah. No, it's people living in those neighborhoods. They work in other boroughs. They take the subway, and they have foreign-born populations who regularly travel back and forth to the old country. That's something you didn't have in the old days. I mean, basically, the airliners, the airplanes, these flying subways, they played a key role in making this virus go. That's why heat is on the World Health Organization and its master, China, because China basically held off. Now they've had their own investigation because of the SARS, which was a pretty bad one, not quite as bad as coronavirus, but close. They enacted rules. And, of course, they love to pass laws. Well, all politicians do. All governments do. The question is who's going to obey them. And what happened was, those few doctors who raised the alarm in the early December that I think we have a new SARS, these guys were covering their butts. I believe in that Chernobyl TV show, they showed that in the early stages of the meltdown, the local, Soviet, the local communist officials got together and agreed we got to shut down, news. Nobody outside should know what's going on, including Moscow. And that is fairly typical of these totalitarian states. And it's a hard habit to break in China. I mean, it was the rule. You're not supposed to keep the information to yourself. You report it to the center, and the center didn't know for several weeks that something was going on. And how did they find out? The internet, because the internet lit up when they read about this hero doctor, because he later died of coronavirus, and there were several other doctors who had disappeared, and many more who basically agreed with the whistleblowers, as it were. They were known to have been talked to by the MSS, the secret police, and basically read the Riot Act. So China has a problem internally. They have to solve. They can pass all the rules and regulations they want, but they basically screwed the pooch. They allowed this to get out of hand, and now they're trying to deny any responsibility. That is not how you solve the problem. And I think China is going to take a lot of heat down the road in the next few months because of that, because their story is not selling, blaming it on the Americans. I mean, come on. I mean, yeah, that's been going on for a long time. And how many times do we have to find out it's false before you say, maybe this isn't generally true.
Jim, they have their, how to describe it, sycophants and supporters, many, unfortunately, who have audiences around the planet that will repeat that grotesque lie. It has been repeated.
Yes, I know, it's an old hat,
and it's old hat, but it because of the sensationalist nature of major media in the United States, they get a magnification out of it, and I'm sure that pleases Beijing no end. I'm not disagreeing with you that in the long run, China is going to pay a huge price for this. I think we're already seeing that here in the United States. But nevertheless, it's an opportunity for them to buy time and seed doubt. That's why they went with the big lie.
Well, they're also the one of the major developments of the modern dictatorship, first with the communists and then the National Socialists and the International Socialists, was the importance of controlling mass media, because mass media didn't really exist until the mid 19th century. And I think one thing people picked up on right early on was there's the short-term, manipulation and the long-term truth. They are separate entities.
Absolutely. The mass media begins really with the telegraph, when you can actually get it out and get a lie repeated, or the truth. You needed the penny press. You needed the steam press. The steam press is what really got it going, because the telegraph mostly got commercial information. That's why it was so big early on, or emergency information. But mass media is something people would consume every day. Once it was cheap enough, for the majority of the population who were already literate. Our population was one of the most literate populations early on, even during the colonial period, mostly for Bible worship. But we know better. They were not reading the Bible all the time. The expensive newspapers, the weekly newspapers, they would be posted on a bulletin board under, a little roof, as it were, in many villages, and people would come down and read it because they couldn't afford to buy it. But once you got the penny press, where literally, it cost the equivalent of today, maybe a quarter, 50 cents, and it was a novelty, and the people running these new newspapers quickly realized, it was a market economy, what sells is scandal. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. If it bleeds, it leads. Sports, they quickly realized sports are something. Commercial sports grew because of the ability to publicize it, to basically make heroes out of exceptional athletes. Again, that's a modern thing. In the past, you had, had the Olympics, but that was every 4 years. I'm talking in antiquity, and they would make statues out of some of these guys, but they weren't everyday heroes. The mass media made news an everyday event. And as I had more than one news director years ago when I was a pundit on a regular basis, before I went on air, sometimes the news director or whatever would be there and say, we got to feed the beast. They got a little battle weary after a while, because especially after the 80s, when you had the satellite news, the CNN and what have you, you had to
literally make up news. You had to recycle old news.
All right, hey Jim, I want to get back to the consequences of China's lie just for a second, and ultimately address it to the spread of the disease in a quasi way, Dan, to your question about Belt and Road. And Jim's hit the core of it, which is the Chinese people moving through or out of Hubei province spread it, both internally and externally. But they hid it because the evidence is mounting, and you go back and look at reports that did come out of China, a handful, not all of them the internet, but some of it took a while for the anecdotal transmission, that this disease cropped up, was identified in Wuhan the last part of November 2019. And for one thing is that China does report to the World Health Organization on December 31st that there is some sort of outbreak. That's also 2 or 3 days after Dr. Li, that's the hero doctor that Jim was mentioning. By the way, I wrote about him, in that column I wrote February 5th or 6th, that you had to go back and put a tag on in the end because we learned
he died like the day after we published.
Exactly, because I think I wrote that column on the 4th of February. It came out on the 5th, and you had it up on the 6th, and that was the day. I think he died on the 6th, and we didn't find out about it until a couple of days later. But the China sat on that information, let's say 5 weeks, before they even said anything to the World Health Organization, and then in the middle of January, I forget the exact date, but you can find it. You can find the tweet from the WHO, and I know that sounds like I'm talking about Pete Townshend's band. No, I'm not. World Health Organization, and right in the middle of January, it says that there's no evidence of human-to-human transmission. That was another direct lie, and Beijing's responsible for that. Because that's the thanks, Jim. That's the contact point, World Health Organization. And I don't think it's a conspiracy theory to say that China exerts undue influence on the World Health Organization and a couple of other similar international bodies. The Chinese Communist Party leadership has worked assiduously over the last 20 years to gain political and economic influence in some of these world organizations, and in this case,
they were doing
insidious.
They were doing that early on. During the 1980s, for a while, I dated a gal. She was from Peru, who worked in the UN, and we just be chatting about and she'd talk about that. The Chinese own this, the Chinese own that.
Yeah.
Even then, but you're right. In the last 20 years, they've amped it up.
Exactly, and you're seeing it. Right, you're seeing it deleteriously expressed with a great deal of hurt. Now, here's where I'm going to connect it to the travel issue. Jim, you brought up Thailand, and just a background on this, I think I mentioned this in an earlier strategy talk, but Michael Yan, who's a compadre of mine, and I had a couple of Skype chats in January, and he was telling me about this disease cropping up in Thailand, and he was talking to several senior Thai health officials, including an MD. I remember he said his name, but I know Michael's written about this in Bangkok, who said that they were Chinese tourists who had it, and he talked to them, and secondhand, the doctor telling Michael is, but they said they came here and carrying the disease, and now they've got it, and we've got them in hospitals, and we're trying to isolate them. Thailand, Jim, I learned something today. I thought they got the normal amount of Chinese tourists, but they got a lot of them.
Oh, yeah, it's about over a third of their tourism visits are Chinese.
All right. I know it's a huge. Well, Thailand's supposed to be one of the Chinese favorite places to go.
Oh, it is, and it's cheap. It's nearby,
exactly.
Et cetera, et cetera.
Quick flight, and within 3 or 4 days of that Skype chat with Michael Yan, it was apparent that Wuhan was the center of it. We already knew that it had cropped up in Wuhan because China in that first week, by January 7th, the January 7th issue of Science magazine, which I read usually a week late, but I will read Science magazine. It's a very authoritative source. There was an article in the first week issue of 2020 talking about this outbreak in Wuhan. It's very anodyne, very simple, but it says it's some potential danger. It was just a couple of paragraph report, but it was also based. If you look back, as I look back on it, they must have had the reporter who put that together some access to some of these internet chats that got Dr. Lee and a couple of other researchers, including one woman who was one of the senior researchers at a research hospital in the Wuhan area. She had talked about it as well, and for a brief time, she was something of an internet star. She would answer emails, and then, as you said, she got talked to by the secret police. But we had an outbreak, Dan, in Thailand. Now take a look at two of the other worst cases that we know of on the planet, Italy and Iran. Jim, both of them participate in the Belt and Road Initiative. And there's a large Chinese working community, commercial community in Italy. I don't know how large it is. I've read anywhere from 200 to 300,000. Iran, immense amount of commercial travel, because Iran really is on the Belt and Road Initiative. That's in the classic. Here we're using rebuilding a notional Silk Road from China to Persia, and an immense number of people, a large number of people comparatively, getting sick and dying in Iran. So you do have, in a larger sense, what I've come up. Here's my term for this. Spread threads, and I'm going to talk about Texas just briefly on this. The Texas State Health Service has a really fine dashboard trying to just give best effort data reports on total number of illnesses, total number of tests, and fatalities. It's improved over the last 10 days. They now have hospitalizations, demographic breakdown, and the like. But as I've been watching this for this web page for the last couple of weeks, you could see there's a cluster around Harris County, which is where Houston is, a cluster around the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, and a cluster Travis County, which is Austin, and Bexar County, which is San Antonio. And yes, okay, so those are the big population areas. But you could see the thread of counties, and it's all done on a county basis, going up Interstate 45, which connects the Houston cluster to Dallas-Fort Worth, up Interstate 35, which is the San Antonio-Austin cluster going to Dallas-Fort Worth, and then kind of I-10 between San Antonio and Houston. Those are lines of truck traffic, commercial traffic, people traveling from one urban area to the other. Now, but the other one that was so telling was the population is much less, but there's still population centers. Amarillo up in the Panhandle, then move south to Lubbock, and then move down to Midland, Odessa, which is those are the two heart of the great Permian Basin, West Texas oil industry. And there's a interstate I-27 that connects them. And you could see the same kind of growth or occurrence of the coronavirus along that little corridor. Now, density is an issue. Jim's talking about it in New York City, which is immensely dense. Last time I looked, which was yesterday, finally, you had fewer than 100 counties in Texas, I think it was 95, that had zero reported coronavirus cases. For a long time, just in reporting, almost all of the cases were in 50 or 60 counties with just 15 around the major metropolitan areas where the density goes up with a vast majority of the coronavirus cases. There are still, I'm going to take a wild guess, I could be checked out on this, about 90 counties in Texas, some of them huge, that haven't had any. That's because they're not on these transportation corridors, or they're not directly on them. If they are, they just go through them, and it's largely empty space, dispersed people, and they are, Jim, geographically distanced instead of socially distanced. It's what it amounts to. So there is something to it. There is something to it about definitely about the travel and about commercial contact. And again, I'm doing this. This is just to be illustrative, but you could see those corridors and see the reports and compares it with the hospitalizations. But when I say you could see it on the graphic of the state of Texas, and where they would have icons of cases, you could see it following these major transportation routes. So there is something to it, Dan. It's not just Belt and Road Initiative. Everybody's got a road initiative with this disease to some degree.
Yeah, density is important because only 20% of the population will catch the disease, the virus, if exposed to it. And of course, about half of those will not show any symptoms, so they'll want to bring around as carriers. Now, you're not going to get any transmission in many parts, as Austin has pointed out, in Texas or in many states, because you need that. You need someone who's got the one of the 20%ers, as it were, who can actually catch it and then transmit it, and especially the 10%ers who are asymptomatic. They're the worst because they don't know they have it, and they're walking around breathing on people. Now the trick is they can breathe on all the people they want, but the only people it counts are the 20% who can receive. So you've only got 20% of the population that is receptive, that will actually develop the disease if they're exposed to it, and of course the half of those will soon show symptoms, and they'll be quarantined, self-quarantine, whatever. But the ones you got to worry about are the asymptomatic carriers who will carry it around for a week or two until their system flushes it out. In other words, fights it off. And so it's basically a matter of density. And of course, as Austin pointed out, the New York City subway is great. Plenty of 20%ers riding the subway. But you go out to cruise ships, naval ships. But you go out to spread out areas, and it just doesn't happen, and it probably never will. In other words, the herd immunity will be developed. In other words, the herd immunity is basically reducing the 20%ers. Well, if a lot of those 20%ers had been exposed before and survived it, they would be less likely to catch it again. So over time, the percentage of the population that can catch, as it were, play catch to those who are pitching, shrinks, and it gets to a certain level, and a population has been described as achieving herd immunity. We still use that with a lot of epidemic diseases that not have been cured. We can vaccinate, say for measles, and so when the anti-vaccine campaign became very popular in many areas, you basically got enough people develop not being protected, not getting vaccinated, newborns, children coming up, and the herd immunity works in reverse. Once you have a large enough population of vulnerable people, then bingo, the cases start popping up and it can spread. So that's just the the epidemiology of these types of diseases. But as Austin points out, the key problem was China had in place procedures to stop it, another SARS, the trouble was they have to impose discipline. I don't know. They're probably going to have to hang a few local officials out to dry, especially in Wuhan. In fact, they've already done that. They've already replaced some senior people. And basically, read them the riot act. They said, look, it's absolutely important. Your career will be over. You'll probably be in jail or worse if this happens on your watch. So, in other words, you have to do something that instinctively you do not want to do. You have to report bad news to the center. And it's a difficult system to implement. People don't want to rock the boat, etc. I mean, it's human nature in general, but it's worse in totalitarian states where being the bearer of bad news, once can be a career ender. Oh, he's unlucky. Oh, he blah 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 blah. He's being stigmatized. But all the procedures and planning in the world do you no good if they're not implemented when they're needed, and that's what happened with China. And China, whether or not they admit it, they're going to have to face the music. I mean, until they implemented these procedures, which basically were secret, these were not publicized. They might have mentioned it, sotto voce, to who. We'll tell you this, but please do not, spread it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's the kind of control China gets in international organizations. Yeah, we'll tell you things, but non-attributable, et cetera, the usual drill. But you want to get these rules out in the open, because if you don't, then there's more incentive, there's more opportunity for an official to say, well, maybe this one, I can, ignore it, maybe it'll go away, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But now we've been bitten twice in 20 years. And the next time we won't be so lucky. Because if they had implemented it, they would have shut down Wuhan and Hubei, immediately. They would have quarantined one province. They would have probably limited, the spread throughout China. Hong Kong, for example, which is technically part of China, they have their own border controls, which they, can exercise to a certain extent. And when it is not exercised to the satisfaction of the general population, you'll have mobs showing up at the border control points. So there's a secondary line of defense. They basically kept the rate of infection very low in Hong Kong. There's another problem which we should get to before we wind this thing up. It's how you report cases of it. There's a huge disparity among countries as to how much impact the virus has had. For example, we were talking about Thailand, where they got hit by it, they didn't expect it. They've had less than one death per million population from the virus so far. In the United States, it's 50 per million. Now, why is it higher in the United States? Well, yeah, there are more cases. But another thing that's going on in the United States, something doesn't get publicized a lot, but I discovered in doing some research on medicine for one of my books on medicine in the United States, we have a tradition of aggressive treatment of all diseases. And that means that when we classify a coronavirus death, anybody who dies is checked for if they have anything remotely, linked to coronavirus. They're tested to see if it's a coronavirus death, and especially in New York City. So they're classifying a lot of deaths that would have not been classified. I mean, coronavirus was just one of many underlying diseases. And this has been pointed out. Most of the fatalities have been people who were already ill from several other things, and the coronavirus just tipped them over the side. And it's not anything else. Influenza could have done it. Most of the people that influenza kills every year are people who already have several illnesses, and bingo, you get the flu, and it's game over, because that just overloads the system. And so you're going to see this. That's what explains the wide discrepancy in the impact. Italy, of course, they have a problem because they have the oldest population in Europe, and although they have national health care, they have one of the worst ones in the continent. Europe. All states in Europe have some sort of national health, but the efficiency of the national health programs varies from country to country. I mean, I discovered this when I looked into it, overseas, and some of them are very, very poorly run. And even the ones that are well run, especially the national health in England, gets lambasted regularly because of the stupid political mistakes they make. Whereas you don't hear anything coming out of Germany or many other, European states. No news. Good news is no news, and you don't hear much from the countries that have efficient national health. They're going to have a lot lower, problems, a lot lower deaths and illnesses from the coronavirus, simply because they have a public health system that is designed to handle just about anything. Sweden is an example. They did not impose quarantine. They basically let everybody know, look, this is what is hitting. This is what you can do individually to limit the spread. And they're suffering no worse than any country in the neighborhood who is going full quarantine. And their economy is in much better shape. Now, that's a lesson for us all, because in the United States and many countries, the medium-term damage is going to be economic.
Jim, let me make one comment on China post-SARS 2002-2003 outbreak. They claimed they had a system in a reporting system that it, quote unquote, wouldn't happen again. I recall reading, I'm going to say this is 2011 or 2012, an article looking at that, back at that epidemic, and at, I believe we were having an influenza epidemic here in the United States at the time, and there was, again, the Chinese government position that we've implemented reporting changes, and so we'll be able to identify and get a grip on future outbreaks. This article, as I recall, it was not about China, but it mentioned that, and that has been picked up. And things that have appeared in the world press, U.S. press, since the middle of January.
Yeah, but
China claimed that they had done it, and yet when it happens again, they hadn't, for the reasons that you outlined about
exactly that doesn't get picked up, and that's crucial. It's one thing. I mean, it's typical politicians in all countries. They love to pass laws, but nobody likes to follow up. Was that law actually implemented? Was it implemented the way it was intended to? And too many times it wasn't.
Yeah. Look, one other thing about to reinforce a point you made about differing statistics, the deep background in differing statistics. Of the first 30 or 35 deaths, fatalities, in the state of Texas, at least a dozen. Now, I've read this I read it within the last 15 days. It was a report focusing primarily on the Houston area. A dozen of the people who died had prior conditions. They were on death's door to begin with. That's my description of it, not what was in the article. But in some ways, they had come in contact with coronavirus, and they're classified as coronavirus fatalities. That's the way it is in the United States. That's not the way it is in other countries, because they would have sat there and first of all, they may have died because the individuals would have already be dead because they wouldn't have received the extraordinary care that you could get in the United States. And so that is, actually it's a positive in a certain, I'd say not a certain sense, a real sense about the U.S. because you have such high quality and available health care that's to help keep people alive and prolong their lives.
Yeah, something else the rest of the world doesn't realize is, although we don't have national health, we do have laws and practices which in effect give emergency care to anybody.
That's right.
Whether they have insurance or not.
Yeah. Dan, I think we've covered beyond the Belt and Road, buddy. Hello, Dan.
Sorry, we have covered beyond the Belt and Road. There's just one last thing. I know we're over time, but I'd like you both to address this real quick. Is that it looks like China stopped reporting and most likely under-reporting what was happening at with the virus, that they weren't reporting accurately what was going on in the rest of China, and they have not reported accurately on the number of deaths and the number of infected.
Indeed, and that's coming out via the internet from Chinese themselves. Mr. Yan, Austin's buddy, our intrepid overseas reporter, he's picked up on a lot of that.
Yeah,
but, for some reason, China is now golden. If you want to increase a lot of political pressure in the West, you simply blame it all on the local politicians and let China, take a walk. But China is still, at fault. And you've still got to be, and I think that'll come out when China says, well, now you can let our people fly, freely into into the West. The countries, I mean, the press is one thing, but the countries, the politicians who have to take the heat if there are any more these outbreaks are going to say, oh no. No. We'd rather take the heat from the local press about, being hard on the Chinese than taking the greater degree of heat if more of our citizens die. All politics is local, as the saying goes. And that's what it's going to come down to.
Well, you've got here the curious situation here in the United States of a president that will flat out argue with the press asking a question like that.
Well, that's another problem. The United States has a unique situation where the media is declared war on the sitting on a very popular sitting president, and we know how that's working out.
All right. I think we've covered it.
Good. Thanks, and we'll talk to you both next time. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.